In the winter of 1847, Margaret Holbrook faced a choice no mother should ever confront. Her husband Samuel lay frozen in their cabin, 3 children growing weaker by the day, and the nearest settlement buried under 20 feet of snow. The Colorado Territory was unforgiving, but what happened next would haunt the frontier for generations. When spring finally broke and neighbors reached the isolated cabin, they found the children alive, but forever changed. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, hollow-eyed and silent. The rumors started immediately, whispers of what she had done to keep her family breathing through that endless winter. Some called it madness, others called it the deepest kind of love, twisted by desperation. But what really happened in that cabin during those dark months? What drove a devoted mother to cross a line that should never be crossed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Holbrook's hands were gentle as he carved another wooden horse for his son Thomas, the shavings curling away from his knife in perfect spirals. The firelight danced across his weathered face, casting shadows that deepened the lines earned from years under the Colorado sun. Margaret watched him from her place by the hearth, mending little Mary's torn dress with careful stitches, while baby James slept peacefully in his cradle nearby. "Papa, will you tell us about the great buffalo herds again?" Thomas asked, his 12-year-old eyes bright with the hunger for stories that only a father could satisfy. Samuel's wedding ring caught the light as he set down his carving. The simple gold band had been his grandfather's, passed down through generations of men who understood the weight of providing for a family. "Well now, son, I reckon I could spin that tale one more time." Margaret smiled, her needle pausing in its work. These were the moments that made their isolation bearable, the 4 walls of their cabin becoming a universe complete unto itself. Outside, the October wind carried the promise of winter, but inside, love warmed them more thoroughly than the crackling logs. Their cabin sat in a valley 3 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement of Millfield. Samuel had chosen this spot for its protection from the worst winds, and its proximity to the creek that would provide water even when ice claimed the surface. He'd built every board and beam with his own hands, thinking of Margaret's comfort and his children's safety with each nail driven home. "Tell me about Mama's garden next spring," Mary said, her 8-year-old voice soft with drowsiness as she leaned against her mother's knee. Margaret's fingers found their daughter's golden hair, stroking it with the tenderness that came as naturally as breathing. "Oh, my sweet girl, we'll plant carrots and potatoes, beans that climb up tall poles, and flowers to make the cabin pretty. Purple lupines and yellow black-eyed Susan." Samuel's eyes met his wife's across the small room, and in that glance passed the understanding that had sustained them through 7 years of marriage. They had chosen this life deliberately, the hardships and the rewards equally their own. No landlords, no bosses, no one to answer to but themselves, and the land that demanded everything and gave back in proportion to the effort invested. The cabin reflected their partnership. Margaret's quilts covered the rough-hewn furniture Samuel had built, her preserves lined the shelves he'd crafted, and her herb bundles hung from the rafters he'd raised. Every corner spoke of their shared vision of a life built by their own hands. Baby James stirred in his cradle, and Margaret rose to tend to him, her movements efficient and loving. At 18 months he was just beginning to say "Mama" and "Papa" in his sweet, halting way. Samuel often said, the boy had his mother's thoughtful eyes and his father's stubborn chin. "The snow will come early this year," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of observation rather than worry. "The animals are telling us. Seen more geese heading south than I ever have in October, and the squirrels are gathering like their lives depend on it." Margaret nodded, adjusting James in her arms. "We're ready for it. The root cellar's full, we've got enough firewood stacked to last until March, and I've preserved more meat than we've ever had." Thomas looked up from the wooden horse he'd been admiring. "Will we be snowed in like last winter?" "Might be, son," Samuel replied. But that just means more time for stories and more time for your mama to teach you and Mary your letters. Margaret settled back into her chair, James nursing contentedly. And more time for you to finish that rocking horse you've been promising, Mary. Samuel chuckled, the sound rich and warm. A man's got to have projects to keep his hands busy during the long nights. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney Samuel had carefully constructed to draw just right. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters he'd hung with such care. But inside their small world, all was peace and contentment. These were the last days before everything changed. The last evening when Samuel's presence filled their home with security, when Margaret could look at her 3 children and know beyond doubt that they were safe and loved, and wanted for nothing that truly mattered. Tomorrow would bring new signs of the coming storm, but tonight they were simply a family, complete and happy in their chosen isolation, trusting in their preparations and in each other to weather whatever the frontier might send their way. Samuel's leather-bound weather journal lay open on the rough wooden table, its pages filled with his careful observations recorded in steady handwriting. Each morning for the past 3 years, he had noted the temperature, wind direction, cloud formations, and any unusual animal behavior. The ritual had become as natural as breathing, a frontiersman's attempt to read the language the wilderness spoke to those willing to listen. "Listen to this, Margaret," he said, running his finger down the columns of data. October 15th, last year, we had our first frost. October 20th the year before. This year, we've already had 3 hard frosts, and it's only the 10th. Margaret looked up from where she was teaching Mary her letters at the kitchen table. The alphabet scratched into a piece of bark served as their makeshift slate, and Mary's small finger traced each letter with determined concentration. "What do you think it means?" "Winter's coming early and hard." Samuel closed the journal and moved to the window, peering out at the grey sky that seemed to press down upon their valley like a heavy wool blanket. "The creek's running lower than I've ever seen it for October. That means the snow up in the high country is already thick enough to slow the melt." Thomas, who had been practicing his sums on another piece of bark, looked up with the quick intelligence that reminded Margaret so much of his father. "Will we have enough food, Papa?" Samuel's weathered hand found his son's shoulder. "More than enough, boy. Your mama and we've been preparing for winter since the day we arrived in this valley. We've got salt pork enough for a dozen families, dried beans, cornmeal, and all your mama's preserved vegetables. The root cellar's so full we can barely close the door." It was true. Margaret felt a deep satisfaction when she thought of their stores. Rows upon rows of glass jars caught the lamplight like jewels. Pickled beets, green beans, carrots in brine, and applesauce sweetened with the wild honey Samuel had taken from a tree hollow. The dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters, their sharp, clean scents mixing with the wood smoke and leather that perfumed their home. Baby James, now steady on his feet, but still wobbly in his walking, toddled over to his father and raised his arms to be lifted. Samuel scooped him up with easy strength, and the child babbled happily, his tiny hands patting his father's bearded cheeks. "Mama, look," Mary said, holding up her practice bark. "I wrote my whole name." Margaret examined the careful letters, each one formed with painstaking precision. "Beautiful, sweetheart. You'll be reading books before you know it." "Will you tell me the story about your mama again?" Mary asked, settling against Margaret's side with the trust that children reserve for the safest places in their world. Margaret's voice took on the cadence of well-loved stories. "My mama lived in a big house in Pennsylvania, with glass windows in every room and carpets on the floors. She had 7 brothers and sisters, and every Sunday they would dress in their finest clothes and walk to church together." "Why did you leave there to come here?" Thomas asked, though he'd heard the answer many times. "Because," Margaret said, her eyes finding Samuel's across the room, "sometimes a person finds something more precious than comfort. Your papa and we wanted to build something with our own hands. We wanted land that belonged to us, not to some distant landlord who'd never walked its soil or drunk from its streams. Samuel nodded, jostling James gently. Out here, a man answers to nobody but his family and his conscience. When you work your own land, everything you build and grow and achieve belongs to you and your children. The wind outside picked up again, whistling through the gaps in the log, chinkling with a sound that spoke of vast distances and endless sky. But inside the cabin, the lamp burned steady and warm. Margaret had sewn heavy curtains from wool cloth, and they kept out the drafts while holding in the precious heat from their fireplace. "Tomorrow I'll check our firewood supply one more time," Samuel said, his voice carrying the methodical planning that had kept them alive and comfortable in this remote place. "And I want to reinforce the chicken coop. If this winter's as hard as I think it'll be, we'll need every egg those birds can give us." Margaret rose and began preparing their evening meal, her movements efficient and practiced in the small space. Cornbread batter mixed in a wooden bowl, beans simmering in the iron pot, and slices of precious bacon laid ready for the pan. The routine of family life continued, steady and comforting, while outside their valley the great wheels of weather and fate began their inexorable turn toward darkness. The letters from town arrived with Jake Morrison's final supply run before winter, tied with string and carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the mountain weather. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she recognized her sister Catherine's flowing script on the topmost envelope. Mail was precious in their isolated valley, a lifeline to the world beyond their mountains. 3 letters this time, Jake said, his grizzled face creasing into a smile as he handed over the bundle. The old trader had been making supply runs to the scattered families in these mountains for 15 years, and he knew the hunger for news from civilization that gnawed at even the most self-sufficient settlers. Margaret settled into her rocking chair, the same one where she did her mending and nursed her babies, and carefully opened Catherine's letter. The paper was fine and smooth, so different from the rough bark and scraps they used for their daily writing. Thomas and Mary gathered close, eager to hear news from the mysterious East, where their aunt lived in a world of gas lamps and cobblestone streets. "My dearest Margaret," she read aloud, "Philadelphia grows more crowded each year. The noise of carriages and omnibuses never ceases, and the smoke from all the factories makes the air thick enough to taste. How I envy you your clean mountain air and the silence that must surround your cabin." Samuel chuckled from his place at the table, where he was examining the new steel traps Jake had brought. "Catherine still thinks we're living some kind of romantic adventure out here. Aunt Catherine says there are gas lamps on every street corner now," Margaret continued, "and something called a telegraph that can send messages faster than any horse. She says they're talking about building a railroad that will reach all the way to California someday." The children listened with wide eyes to descriptions of a world that seemed as fantastical as fairy tales. Ice cream sold on street corners, theaters with velvet curtains, and shops filled with goods from around the world. It was a world Margaret had chosen to leave behind, but sometimes, reading Catherine's letters, she felt a small pang for the ease and comfort of that old life. The second letter came from the postmaster in Millfield, containing news of their scattered neighbors. The Hendersons had welcomed their 4th child, a healthy boy born in September. Old Pete Carlson had finally struck gold in his claim up Willow Creek, enough to last him through the winter in comfortable style. The widow Morrison was planning to head back east, come spring, saying the frontier was too hard for a woman alone. But it was the 3rd letter that brought troubling news. It came from Dr. Brennan, in Millfield, written in his careful medical hand. A family named the Donners had tried to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains and been trapped by early snows. When rescue parties finally reached them, they found horrors that no decent person should have to contemplate. Margaret read the letter silently first, her face growing pale. Samuel noticed her expression and moved closer. "What is it?" She folded the letter quickly. "Just news from town, nothing that concerns us." But Samuel had read the worry in her eyes. Later, after the children were in bed, she showed him Dr. Brennan's letter. They read it together by lamplight, their faces grave as they absorbed the terrible details of what desperation could drive people to do. Such things happen when folks aren't properly prepared, Samuel said quietly, but Margaret could hear the unease beneath his confident words. We're not like those poor souls. We've got supplies enough for 2 winters if need be. Margaret nodded, but the letter had planted a seed of cold fear in her chest. The Donners had been experienced travelers, well-equipped and guided by men who knew the mountain. Yet when winter trapped them, when their supplies ran out and their children began to starve, they had been forced to choices that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. She tucked the letters into her cedar box, where she kept her most precious possessions, her mother's Bible, her wedding ring from the ceremony, and the few photographs they owned. These letters were their connection to the broader world, proof that beyond their valley, life continued in all its complexity and change. Outside their cabin, Jake Morrison was bedding down in the barn, grateful for shelter before making his way back to Millfield. This would be his last trip until spring thaw. After he left in the morning, they would be truly alone, cut off from the world by distance and weather, until the snows retreated. Margaret looked around their snug cabin, taking comfort in their careful preparations. They were not the Donners. They were ready for winter. They had each other, and they had faith that their foresight and hard work would carry them through whatever the mountain weather might bring. The broken thermometer lay scattered in glittering fragments across the cabin floor, its mercury pooled in silver droplets that caught the firelight like fallen stars. Samuel stared at the wreckage of his most trusted instrument, the tool that had helped him predict weather patterns for 3 years with uncanny accuracy. The storm had arrived without the gradual warning they expected. No gentle snowfall building over days, no preliminary winds to signal the approaching front. Instead, the sky had simply opened and unleashed a fury that seemed to come from the very heart of winter itself. "I've never seen anything like this," Samuel said, pressing his face to the window. The glass was already frosting over, but through the clear patches he could see snow falling so thick it created a white wall beyond their porch. The wind must be blowing 50 miles an hour. Margaret pulled the children closer to the fire, baby James fussing in her arms as the cabin shook under the assault of the wind. The sturdy logs Samuel had so carefully fitted groaned and creaked, and fine snow was finding its way through chinks in the chinkling, creating small drifts along the base of the walls. "How long will it last, Papa?" Thomas asked, his voice smaller than usual. The 12-year-old had lived through mountain storms before, but nothing that made their solid cabin feel fragile. "Hard to say without the thermometer," Samuel replied, sweeping up the glass fragments with a corn broom. The mercury scattered and rolled, impossible to collect. But storms like this usually blow themselves out in a day or two. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the roaring fire. Margaret had already pulled out their heaviest quilts, and she wrapped Mary in the thick wool blanket her mother had sent from Pennsylvania. The little girl's teeth were chattering, not from cold alone but from the nervous energy that filled the air. Outside, the wind howled with a voice that seemed almost alive, rising and falling in patterns that sounded like screaming. Snow piled against the windows with startling speed, and Samuel realized they would soon lose the light entirely. "We need to check on the animals," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. The chickens were in their reinforced coop, but he worried about the cow and the 2 horses in the barn. If snow blocked the barn door, they might not be able to reach the animals for days. "Samuel." "No," Margaret said, fear sharp in her voice. "You can barely see the barn from here." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. The barn was only 30 yards from the cabin, but in this whiteout it might as well have been 30 miles. Still, the animals depended on them. "I'll rope myself to the porch post. Follow the rope back." Margaret watched him prepare, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had heard stories of men who walked out into blizzards and were found frozen 20 feet from their own doors, confused by the white blindness that made familiar landscapes unrecognizable. Samuel tied one end of their strongest rope around his waist and the other to the sturdy porch post he had sunk deep into the ground. He pulled his hat low and wrapped a scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. "Keep the fire burning bright," he told Margaret. "If I get turned around out there, the light in the window might be all that guides me home." The moment he opened the door, the storm tried to tear it from his hands. Wind and snow exploded into the cabin with the force of a waterfall, and Margaret had to throw her full weight against the door to close it behind him. Through the window, she could see Samuel's dark shape moving slowly toward the barn, the rope stretched taut behind him. Then the snow swallowed him completely, and she could see nothing but the endless white fury that had engulfed their world. The Lilla huddled around the fire, their games forgotten. This was no ordinary winter storm, and even they could sense that something fundamental had changed. The comfortable routine of their lives had been shattered as completely as Samuel's thermometer, and they were now at the mercy of forces beyond their control or understanding. Minutes passed like hours. Margaret strained to see any sign of Samuel's return, but the storm had transformed their familiar valley into an alien landscape of wind and white. The rope stretched from the porch post into nothingness, their only connection to the man who had become their anchor in this suddenly dangerous world. The fire popped and hissed, the only sound inside the cabin that could compete with the relentless roar of the wind. And in that warmth and light, surrounded by her children, Margaret began to understand that they were truly alone now, cut off from everything except each other, and their faith in Samuel's ability to find his way home through the storm. Samuel's bloodied coat hung from a nail by the door, the dark stains frozen into the heavy wool fabric. Margaret had found it that morning, partially buried in a snowdrift 20 yards from the cabin, torn and empty. The sight of it had stopped her heart for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as she understood what it meant. 3 days had passed since Samuel disappeared into the white fury of the storm. 3 days of Margaret calling his name into the wind, of searching every drift and hollow within reach of their cabin, of hoping against hope that he had simply taken shelter somewhere and would appear with his familiar grin and some story of adventure. The rope still stretched from the porch post to where the barn stood, buried under 8 feet of snow. She had followed it that first morning, stumbling through drifts that came up to her chest, calling for him until her voice was raw. At the barn, she found the door blocked solid with snow and ice. It had taken her hours to dig through to the animals inside. The cow was still alive, though thin and frightened. The horses whickered softly when they saw her, grateful for the handful of oats she managed to bring them. But there was no sign of Samuel, no footprints, no disturbed snow, nothing to indicate he had ever reached the barn that terrible night. "Mama, when is Papa coming home?" Mary asked for the 100th time, her 8-year-old voice small and uncertain. She sat by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched for any sign of movement in the endless white landscape. Margaret knelt beside her daughter, her heart breaking at the innocent hope in the child's eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart. The storm was very bad, and Papa might be waiting somewhere safe for it to calm down." But she knew the truth. Samuel would never have waited somewhere safe while his family needed him. He would have fought through any storm, crawled through any drift to get back to them. The fact that he hadn't returned meant only one thing, though she couldn't bring herself to say the words aloud. Thomas, old enough to understand what the bloodied coat meant, had grown quiet and watchful. He helped Margaret with the daily chores without being asked, splitting kindling and carrying water from the creek when the wind died down enough to make the trip safely. His young face had taken on a gravity that should have been years in the future. Baby James continued to babble and play, too young to understand that the most important person in his small world was never coming home. He toddled around the cabin on unsteady legs, occasionally calling Paha in his sweet, unclear way, and each time the sound was like a knife in Margaret's chest. The storm had finally exhausted itself the previous evening, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls until the windows were half covered. The familiar shapes of their valley were gone, replaced by smooth white curves that bore no resemblance to the landscape she knew. Trees had vanished completely beneath the snow, and the creek was silent under its thick coat of ice. Margaret stood at the window, holding Samuel's coat in her hands. The blood had turned brown against the dark wool, and there were tears in the fabric that looked like claw marks. She tried not to think about what might have happened to him out there in the howling darkness. A fall, perhaps, or an encounter with one of the mountain cats that sometimes prowled the high country when winter drove them down in search of prey. "He's not coming back, is he?" Thomas said quietly, appearing beside her at the window. Margaret looked down at her eldest son, seeing Samuel's steady gaze reflected in the boy's dark eyes. There was no point in continuing the pretext. Thomas was old enough for truth, and they would need to rely on each other now more than ever. "No, son, I don't think he is." Thomas nodded slowly, accepting the burden of this knowledge with a maturity that made Margaret proud and heartbroken at the same time. "What do we do now?" Margaret folded Samuel's coat carefully, her fingers tracing the tears in the fabric. Outside, the sun was trying to break through the heavy clouds, casting the snow-covered world in a harsh, brilliant light that hurt to look at directly. "Now we survive," she said simply. "We use everything your papa taught us, and we make it through this winter. That's what he would want us to do." She hung the coat back on its nail, a monument to the man who had tried so hard to take care of them. Tomorrow she would have to take inventory of their supplies, figure out how to stretch their food through the long months ahead. But tonight, they would mourn the gentle giant who had made them feel safe in this wild country. The empty pantry shelves stared back at Margaret like hollow eyes, their barren surfaces a stark reminder of how quickly their carefully planned supplies were disappearing. Where once neat rows of preserves and dried goods had promised security through the long winter, now only a few scattered jars and half-empty sacks remained. She had found Samuel's body that morning, frozen solid beneath a drift near the woodshed. The sight had nearly broken her. His face peaceful but blue with cold, his hands still reaching toward the cabin, as if he had been trying to crawl home when the cold finally claimed him. Thomas had helped her drag him inside, both of them weeping as they struggled with his rigid form. Now Samuel lay in the small back room, wrapped in their best quilt. The ground was frozen too hard for burial, and Margaret couldn't bear the thought of leaving him outside for the scavengers. So there he rested, preserved by the bitter cold, while she tried to explain to her children why Papa would never wake up again. "Mama, I'm hungry," Mary said, her small voice cutting through Margaret's dark thoughts. The little girl had grown thinner in just the few days since Samuel's disappearance, her cheeks losing the roundness that had made her look like a cherub. Margaret opened the last jar of applesauce, spooning small portions into wooden bowls. The sweet, cinnamon-scented fruit was one of their most precious remaining supplies, but the children needed something to comfort them in their grief. She watched them eat with desperate eyes, noting how quickly they emptied their bowls and how they looked hopefully for more. "That's all for now, my loves," she said gently. "We need to make our food last until spring," but spring felt impossibly far away. According to Samuel's weather journal, they typically saw the last snow in May. It was now only November, which meant at least 6 more months of winter stretched ahead of them. Margaret did quick calculations in her head, counting jars and measuring portions, and the numbers never worked out to enough. They had salt pork for perhaps 2 more weeks, if she rationed it carefully. A sack of cornmeal that might last a month, dried beans that would stretch for 6 weeks if she made thin soup, some preserved vegetables, a precious few eggs from the surviving chickens, and milk from the cow when she could manage to reach the barn through the drifts. Baby James fussed in his cradle, his cries thin and weak. Margaret lifted him, feeling how light he had become. At 18 months he should have been growing plump and sturdy, but instead he felt fragile in her arms, his little ribs showing through his clothes. Thomas appeared at her elbow, his young face grave with responsibility. "Mama, what about the animals? Could we?" He couldn't finish the thought. But Margaret understood. The cow, the chickens, the horses buried in the barn. They represented meat sustenance that could keep her children alive. But they also represented hope for the future. The cow would give milk through the spring, The chickens would lay eggs. The horses would be needed for ploughing and travel when the snows finally melted. "Not yet," she said quietly. "We'll find another way." That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat by the dying fire and tried to make sense of their situation. She spread Samuel's papers on the table, his weather journal, his careful inventories of their supplies, his maps of the surrounding country. Everything he had written spoke of a man confident in his ability to provide for his family, certain that his preparations would carry them through any hardship. But Samuel had never imagined a storm like the one that took his life. He had never planned for the possibility that he wouldn't be there to hunt fresh meat, to make repairs, to stretch their supplies with his woodcraft and frontier knowledge. Margaret opened the last of his letters, one she had been saving like a talisman against despair. It was from his brother in Kansas, full of talk about good harvests and growing towns, an invitation to come east, where life was easier and children didn't have to face such harsh winters. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the wooden box. East meant safety, but east was 1,000 miles away across snow-covered mountains and frozen plains. East might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did them now. The fire crackled lower, and Margaret added one more precious log to keep the flames alive. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, promising another storm. And in the small back room, Samuel lay silent and cold, beyond worrying about the family he had loved so fiercely but could no longer protect. Margaret's sewing kit lay open on the kitchen table, its contents scattered like the remnants of a more civilized time. Needles bent from overuse, thread worn thin from constant mending, and scraps of fabric too precious to discard despite their ragged condition. Her fingers worked mechanically, patching Thomas's torn trousers with a piece cut from her own petticoat. Everything was falling apart. Not just their clothes, though those bore the evidence of their increasingly desperate circumstances, but the very fabric of the life they had built together. The children's garments hung loose on their shrinking frames, and Margaret found herself taking in seams weakly, gathering fabric that had once fit snugly around healthy, well-fed bodies. "Mama, my shoes have holes," Mary said, lifting her small foot to show where the leather sole had separated completely from the upper. The mountain cold was seeping through, and the child's toes were red and numb, despite the wool stockings Margaret had knitted. Margaret examined the shoe with growing despair. Samuel would have known how to repair it, would have cut new leather from his stock of hides, and sewn it with the skill of a man who had made everything they owned. But Margaret's attempts at leather work were clumsy and crude, and the shoes she tried to mend lasted only days before falling apart again. The children watched her with eyes that had grown too large for their faces, dark circles beneath them speaking of hunger and worry that no child should carry. Thomas, especially, seemed to be aging before her eyes, his 12-year-old shoulders carrying a weight that belonged to grown men. He had stopped asking when Papa was coming back, had stopped playing with his wooden toys, had become quiet and watchful in a way that broke Margaret's heart. "Tell us a story, Mama," Mary said, curling up beside her on the bench. "Tell us about the princess and the magic castle." Margaret's needle paused in its work. The old stories felt hollow now, tales of magic and happy endings that belonged to a world where fathers came home every evening and children never went to bed hungry. But Mary's eyes held such hope, such desperate need for something beautiful to hold on to in their darkening world. "Once upon a time," Margaret began, her voice soft and uncertain, "there was a brave princess who lived in a castle made of ice and snow." As she spoke, weaving a story of courage and perseverance, Margaret noticed how thin her own voice sounded, how the words seemed to echo in their small cabin. They were all growing smaller, all fading like shadows, as the winter tightened its grip around them. Baby James had stopped gaining weight entirely. At 18 months he should have been running and chattering, getting into everything with the boundless energy of a toddler. Instead, he lay listless in his cradle, his eyes too bright in his pale face, his tiny hands clutching at Margaret's dress whenever she came near. The cow had stopped giving milk 3 days ago. Margaret had forced herself to trudge through the snow to the barn, hoping against hope, but the animal stood with her head hanging low, her ribs showing through her dull coat. Without proper feed, without the strength that came from adequate nutrition, the cow was slowly starving along with the rest of them. Margaret's own clothes hung on her frame like sackcloth. She had taken to wearing Samuel's shirts, cinching them with rope around her waist, but even those were becoming too large. Her wedding ring, once snug on her finger, now spun loosely and threatened to slip off entirely. That night, after the children finally slept, Margaret sat alone with her sewing. By the dim light of their precious candle, she worked on a project that filled her with shame and desperation. She was taking apart Samuel's Sunday suit, the fine wool coat he had worn to their wedding, carefully removing the stitches to salvage every scrap of fabric. The suit had been his pride, purchased with money saved over months of trapping and trading. He had looked so handsome in it, so proud and strong as he stood beside her in the little church in Pennsylvania. Now she was reducing it to patches and scraps, feeding it piece by piece to their endless need for repairs. As she worked, tears dripped onto the dark wool, staining it with salt and sorrow. Outside, the wind howled with familiar fury, and snow pelted against the windows like thrown stones. And in the back room, Samuel lay wrapped in their wedding quilt, silent witness to the slow dissolution of everything he had worked so hard to build and protect. Thomas's wooden toy horse sat abandoned on the windowsill, its painted mane chipped and faded, a relic from a time when children had energy for play. Samuel had carved it the previous winter, whittling by firelight while the family gathered close, his knife moving with patient precision to create the flowing lines of a Mustang in full gallop. Now it stood forgotten, a monument to innocence that had died along with its maker. Margaret stared at the toy as she spooned the last of their bean soup into 3 small bowls. The portions had grown so meager that they barely covered the bottom, more broth than substance, but it was all they had left. Her hands shook with weakness as she divided the pitiful meal, trying to give the children slightly larger shares while leaving almost nothing for herself. "Is this all, Mama?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The little girl's golden hair had grown dull and lifeless, hanging in tangled strands around a face that had lost its childish roundness. Dark shadows circled her eyes, and her small hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. "Eat slowly, sweetheart," Margaret said, settling beside her daughter on the bench. "Make it last." Thomas ate in silence, his jaw working methodically on each precious mouthful. At 12, he understood better than his sister how desperate their situation had become. He had stopped asking for more food weeks ago, had learned to ignore the constant gnawing in his belly that never went away. Margaret caught him sometimes staring at nothing, his young face wearing an expression of resignation that belonged on someone decades older. Baby James lay listless in his cradle, too weak now to cry with any real strength. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and his skin had taken on a translucent quality that terrified Margaret. She had tried to give him milk from the cow, but the animal had died 3 days ago, collapsing in the barn with a soft, defeated sigh. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers. They were almost out of firewood, forced to choose between warmth and cooking fuel. Margaret had already burned Samuel's chair, his workbench, and most of his tools. The cabin grew colder each day, and she could see her breath when she spoke. As darkness settled over their valley, Margaret faced the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. They were going to die here, all of them. The children would waste away before her eyes, and she would follow them into whatever came after this world of hunger and cold and endless night. Unless, the thought crept into her mind like a serpent, coiling around her conscience with whispered justifications. In the back room, Samuel's body lay preserved by the bitter cold, unchanged since the day she had found him. Meat, protein, the difference between life and death for her children. She pushed the thought away with horror, crossing herself as her mother had taught her in the devout Catholic household of her childhood. Such things were not meant for human consideration. There were lines that civilized people did not cross, boundaries that separated man from beast. But as she watched Mary struggle to finish her meager soup, as she heard Thomas's stomach growl with hollow hunger, as she felt baby James growing lighter in her arms each day, Those boundaries began to blur. What was civilization worth if her children died for the sake of it? What was moral righteousness compared to a mother's duty to keep her babies alive? In the great ledger of God's judgment, which would weigh more heavily, the breaking of a taboo, or the death of 3 innocent souls, Margaret rose and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit wasteland that had once been their valley. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, unmarked by any sign of life or hope of rescue. They were alone here, beyond the reach of judgment or salvation, beyond everything except the most basic law of survival. Thomas's wooden horse caught the firelight, its carved features seeming to shift and change in the dancing shadows. Samuel had made it with such love, such faith in a future where his son would have time and strength for toys and games and laughter. That future was dying along with them, fading like smoke from their cooling fire. In the back room, Samuel waited in his frozen silence, and Margaret began to understand that he might yet save them all. Not in the way he had planned, not as the strong provider he had always been, but as the ultimate sacrifice a father could make for his children. The wooden horse watched from its windowsill perch as Margaret finally allowed herself to think the unthinkable, to consider the choice that would either damn her soul or save her children's lives. Samuel's hunting knife lay heavy in Margaret's trembling hands, its steel blade reflecting the dying firelight like a shard of ice. He had kept it razor sharp, honing the edge each evening after his work was done, the rhythmic scrape of whetstone against metal, a comforting sound that spoke of preparedness and care. Now the knife felt like a judgment in her palm, cold and unforgiving as the winter that had driven her to this moment. She stood in the doorway of the back room, looking down at her husband's frozen form. The quilt she had wrapped him in was pulled back, revealing the peaceful expression on his face. Even in death, Samuel looked strong and capable, the man who had promised to protect them through any hardship. He could not have imagined that his protection would come in this form. Margaret's breathing came in short, sharp gasps that clouded the frigid air. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might burst. Every instinct, every teaching of her childhood, every fiber of her civilized being screamed against what she was about to do. But louder than all of those voices was the sound of baby James's weak crying from the main room, the sound of her children dying by inches. She had prayed through the night, kneeling on the cold floor until her knees were numb, begging God for another way. She had searched her mind for any alternative, any possibility she might have overlooked. But the snow showed no signs of melting, their supplies were exhausted, and help would not come until spring, if it came at all. The knife trembled in her grip as she knelt beside Samuel's body. Her vision blurred with tears that froze before they could fall, and she whispered apologies to the man who had loved her with such devotion. "Forgive me," she breathed. "Forgive me, my darling. But they're so hungry, and I don't know what else to do." For a moment, she almost lost her resolve. The magnitude of what she was contemplating crashed over her like an avalanche, threatening to bury her beneath its weight. This was her husband, the father of her children, the man who had held her on their wedding night and promised to love her until death parted them. How could she desecrate his body, even to save their children? But then Mary's voice drifted from the other room, weak and plaintive. "Mama, when will we eat again?" The sound of her daughter's hunger gave Margaret the strength she needed. She was a mother first, before she was a widow, before she was a woman of faith, before she was anything else. Her children's lives were more precious to her than her own soul, and if damning herself would save them, then she would gladly burn in hell for eternity. She closed her eyes and made the first cut. The sound was worse than she had imagined, the knife parting flesh that had been softened by the cold, the wet resistance that spoke of what had once been living warmth. Her stomach heaved, and she had to pause, pressing her hand to her mouth to keep from retching. There was so little food in her belly that she could not afford to lose even that. She worked with mechanical precision, trying not to think about what she was doing, focusing only on the practical necessity of providing for her children. Samuel had taught her to butcher game, had shown her how to prepare meat with clean, efficient cuts. that wasted nothing. She drew on that knowledge now, her hands moving with grim competence despite the horror of the task. When she had cut away enough for a meal, she wrapped the pieces in clean cloth and carried them to the kitchen. The fire had burned low, but she coaxed it back to life with shavings from Thomas's abandoned toys, feeding the flames until they burned hot enough for cooking. As the meat sizzled in their iron pan, filling the cabin with the rich aroma of protein and fat, Margaret felt her body respond with involuntary hunger. Her mouth watered despite her revulsion, her starving flesh betraying her civilized mind. She had not smelled cooking meat in weeks, and the scent was almost overwhelming in its promise of sustenance. The children stirred in their beds, drawn by the unfamiliar but welcome smell. "Mama?" Thomas called softly. "What are you cooking?" Margaret stared at the pan, watching Samuel's flesh brown and crisp, and wondered what words could possibly answer her son's innocent question. How did a mother explain that love sometimes took forms too terrible for human understanding? The family Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its worn pages turned to the story of Abraham and Isaac, the familiar words blurred through Margaret's tears. She had searched through scripture all morning, desperate for some divine precedent, some biblical justification for what she had done. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, reciting verses about sacrifice and devotion, about the lengths to which love would drive the faithful. "And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son," she read aloud to the empty room. Her voice barely a whisper, but God had stayed Abraham's hand, had provided a ram caught in the thickets as an alternative sacrifice. No angel had appeared to stop Margaret's knife. No miracle had delivered them from their extremity. The children had eaten the previous evening with desperate gratitude, their hollow eyes lighting up at the sight of real meat after weeks of thin soup and scraps. They had asked no questions about where it came from, accepting her explanation that she had found some preserved beef they had overlooked. Thomas had eaten with particular enthusiasm, his growing body crying out for the protein it so desperately needed. Margaret watched them sleep now, color already returning to their pale cheeks, strength flowing back into their wasted limbs. Baby James had nursed more vigorously than he had in days, his tiny fists unclenching from the tight balls of pain they had become. For the first time in weeks, he had slept through the night without the weak, mewling cries that had broken her heart. But the improvement in her children's condition only deepened Margaret's torment. She had saved them, yes, but at what cost? What manner of mother fed her babies the flesh of their own father? What kind of love demanded such a monstrous sacrifice? She turned the Bible pages with shaking fingers, searching for comfort in the Psalms, in the promises of forgiveness and redemption that had sustained her through the trials of frontier life. But the words seemed to mock her now, speaking of mercy for sins that fell far short of her transgression. The morning sun streamed through the frost-covered windows, illuminating the domestic scene with deceptive normalcy. The breakfast dishes sat clean and empty, the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and her children slept peacefully in their beds. Anyone looking in might have seen a family weathering winter's hardships with quiet dignity. They could not see the corruption that festered beneath the surface, the knowledge that would poison every meal, every moment of contentment for the rest of Margaret's life. She had become something unnatural, something that existed outside the boundaries of civilization and decency. A mother, yes, but a mother transformed into something that no society could acknowledge or forgive. Thomas stirred in his bed and opened his eyes, looking directly at her, with an expression that made Margaret's blood freeze. For a moment, she saw understanding there, a flash of terrible comprehension that spoke of a boy growing too quickly into knowledge he should never possess. "Good morning, Mama," he said quietly, but his voice carried undertones that had not been there before. "Thank you for dinner last night." Margaret forced a smile, her lips trembling with the effort. "You're welcome, my darling. Are you feeling stronger?" "Much strong." Thomas sat up, his movements less labored than they had been in weeks. "I dreamed about Papa. He was telling me that sometimes people have to do things that seem wrong but are really right, if they're doing them for love. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Had Thomas truly dreamed such a thing, or had he reasoned his way to the truth with the terrible clarity that hunger and hardship had given him? Either possibility filled her with equal measures of relief and horror. Mary woke next, stretching like a contented kitten, more energy in her movements than Margaret had seen since Samuel's death. The little girl's stomach had stopped its constant growling, and her eyes held a brightness that had been absent for too long. "I'm still hungry, Mama," Mary said hopefully. "Do we have more of that good meat?" Margaret's throat closed, and she had to clear it several times before she could speak. "We'll see, sweetheart. We must be careful not to eat too much too quickly after being so hungry." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew she would return to the back room when the children's hunger grew desperate again. The line had been crossed, the boundary shattered, and there would be no turning back now. Samuel's body would sustain them through the winter. One meal at a time, one compromise with damnation at a time. The Bible lay open between them, its holy words a rebuke and a comfort in equal measure, while outside the wind whispered of storms yet to come. Margaret's hand mirror lay cracked across the middle, its silver surface split by a jagged line that divided her reflection into two distorted halves. She had dropped it that morning while attempting to braid her hair, her hands shaking so violently that she could barely hold the simple wooden handle. The crack ran directly through the center of her face, creating a stranger in the glass. One half the woman she had been, the other something she no longer recognized. 3 weeks had passed since that first terrible meal, and the routine of survival had taken on a horrifying normalcy. Each morning she would check the children, measuring their strength and color against their need for sustenance. When Thomas's ribs began to show again, when Mary's eyes grew too bright with hunger, when baby James's cries grew weak and desperate, she would steel herself for another visit to the back room. The process had become methodical, almost clinical. She had learned to work quickly and efficiently, to separate her mind from her hands while she prepared what her children needed to live. Samuel's body, preserved by the relentless cold, had become their salvation, and her damnation rolled into one frozen package. But the reflection in her broken mirror told the true story of what these weeks had cost her. Her face had grown gaunt, not from hunger, but from something deeper, a spiritual starvation that no amount of food could address. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and endless guilt. She had begun talking to herself, carrying on conversations with voices that existed only in her fractured mind. Sometimes it was Samuel assuring her that he understood, that he forgave her for what she had done to his body in service of their children's lives. Sometimes it was her mother, reciting prayers and psalms in the stern voice that had guided Margaret through her childhood. Most disturbing of all were the times when she spoke to the woman she used to be, the Margaret who had sewn quilts and preserved vegetables and worried about nothing more serious than Thomas's reluctance to practice his letters. That woman seemed as distant as a character from a fairy tale, someone who had existed in a different world where mothers faced ordinary challenges and made ordinary choices. The children watched her with growing concern, their young eyes reflecting awareness that their mother was changing in ways that frightened them. Thomas especially had begun to study her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He was old enough to sense that something fundamental had shifted in their family dynamic, even if he couldn't name exactly what it was. "Mama, are you feeling well?" Mary asked one afternoon, her small hand touching Margaret's forehead with the gentle concern that children sometimes showed their parents. "You seem sad all the time now." Margaret forced another smile, the expression feeling like broken glass against her face. "I miss your papa very much, sweetheart." Sometimes grief makes people act strangely, but it wasn't grief that was destroying her. It was the knowledge that she had become something monstrous in service of motherhood. She had crossed a line that existed not just in society's rules, but in the very fabric of human nature, and the crossing had changed her at a cellular level. At night, when the children finally slept, Margaret would stand before her broken mirror and try to recognize the woman staring back at her. The cracks seemed to grow wider each day, dividing her reflection into increasingly distorted fragments. Soon, she thought, there would be nothing left but shards and shadows, pieces too broken to ever fit back together. She had tried to pray, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. How could she ask for forgiveness when she knew she would commit the same sin again the moment her children's hunger demanded it? How could she repent of actions she was prepared to repeat without hesitation? The worst part was the growing hunger in her own eyes. Not physical hunger, which she endured with grim determination, but something darker. The meat had given her strength, too, had awakened appetites she had never known existed. Sometimes she caught herself thinking about it with something approaching anticipation, and the realization filled her with such self-loathing that she had to press her hands against her mouth to keep from screaming. The Bounty Earns reached for her from his cradle, his tiny fingers grasping at the air with renewed vitality. The protein had transformed him from a failing infant into a thriving child, and Margaret loved him with a ferocity that justified anything, even the corruption of her own soul. She picked up the pieces of her broken mirror, studying the fractured woman reflected in each shard. Somewhere among those fragments was the person she used to be, but Margaret was no longer sure she wanted to find her. Thomas's diary lay open on his bed, its pages filled with the careful script Samuel had taught him the previous winter. The child's innocent handwriting documented their daily life with the methodical precision he had inherited from his father. But the recent entries told a story that would have horrified any adult reader. March 12th. Mama made the good meat again today. Mary feels much better. I helped Mama in the back room. She cried while she worked but told me I was a brave boy for helping. Margaret discovered the diary while searching for Thomas's torn stockings to mend. The small leather-bound book had been a gift from Samuel for Christmas, meant to encourage the boy's writing skills. Now it served as an unwitting record of horrors that should never have been witnessed by a 12-year-old child. She read the entries with growing dread, each careful line revealing how much Thomas understood about their situation. The boy had been watching, learning, putting together pieces of the puzzle with the relentless logic that hunger and necessity had forced upon him. March 8th. Papa seems smaller today. Mama says it's because of the cold, but I think it's because of the meat. I know where the meat comes from now. I've known for weeks. Margaret sank onto Thomas's bed, the diary trembling in her hands. She had thought she was protecting him, shielding him from the full weight of what they had been forced to do. But children were more observant than adults gave them credit for, and Thomas had reached his own conclusions about the source of their survival. March 15th. Mary doesn't know yet. She's too little to understand. Baby James just eats and sleeps and smiles. But I know, and I think Mama knows I know. We don't talk about it, but sometimes she looks at me like she's waiting for me to say something. The worst part was the matter-of-fact tone of the entries. Thomas wrote about their cannibalistic survival with the same calm precision he used to record the weather or his daily lessons. The horror had become routine for him, normalized by the simple fact that it kept his family alive. Margaret heard footsteps and quickly closed the diary, but it was too late. Thomas stood in the doorway, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression far too old for his young face. "You read it," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question. Thomas, It's all right, Mum. I wrote it because I needed to write it down somewhere. It felt too big to keep just in my head." Margaret set the diary aside and opened her arms, and Thomas came to her with the trust that still existed between them despite everything that had changed. He felt solid and warm against her chest, heavier than he had been in months, his body strengthened by the terrible sustenance she had provided. "Are you angry with me?" she whispered into his hair. "Are you frightened of what I've become?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his face pressed against her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and certain. "You kept us alive. Papa would be proud of what you did for us." The words should have comforted her, but instead they highlighted the magnitude of what had been taken from this child. Thomas should have been playing with wooden horses and learning his letters, not grappling with moral complexities that would have challenged a grown man. The winter had stolen his innocence as surely as it had stolen his father's life. "I know it's wrong," Thomas continued. "I know what people would say about us if they knew. But they're not here. They didn't watch Mary getting thinner every day. They didn't hear baby James crying from hunger. You did what you had to do." Margaret held him tighter, tears streaming down her face. Her eldest son had become her confessor, her absolver, carrying a burden no child should bear. The knowledge would mark him for life, would shape every choice he made and every relationship he formed. She had saved his body but damaged his soul, and the trade felt less certain with each passing day. "What happens when we run out?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "When there's no more?" Margaret had been asking herself the same question for weeks. Samuel's body, even rationed carefully, would not last forever. Spring still seemed impossibly distant, and they had consumed more than half of their grim supply. "I don't know," she admitted. "We'll find another way." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret wondered what other lines she would be willing to cross when desperation demanded it. The diary lay beside them on the bed, its pages full of a child's careful documentation of the unthinkable, and she realized that some knowledge once gained could never be taken back. Mary's cloth doll sat propped against the cabin wall, its once white dress now stained with dark spots that Margaret tried not to examine too closely. The little girl had been playing with it that morning when the accident happened, when the knife slipped and splattered Samuel's blood across the toy's fabric face. Mary had cried at first, but Margaret had told her it was just gravy from their cooking, and the child had accepted the explanation with the trust that still remained intact in her 8-year-old heart. But Thomas's revelation had shattered the fragile balance Margaret had been trying to maintain. Now, as she watched him sitting by the window, she saw the weight of adult knowledge pressing down on his thin shoulders. He had stopped playing entirely, had begun staring at nothing with eyes that held too much understanding. "I won't eat it anymore," Thomas said suddenly, his voice cutting through the afternoon silence like a blade. "I can't." Margaret looked up from where she was mending Mary's torn stockings, her needle freezing mid-stitch. "What did you say?" "The meat. I won't eat Papa anymore." Thomas turned from the window, his young face set with a determination that reminded her painfully of Samuel. "I know we need food, but I can't put him in my mouth again. I can't swallow my own father." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Margaret felt her carefully constructed world of justifications crumble, exposed for the horror it truly was by her son's moral clarity. "Thomas, you have to eat. You'll die if you don't." "Then I'll die." His voice was steady, matter of fact. "Some things are worse than dying, Mum. You taught me that when you read me stories about knights and heroes, they always chose honor over life." Margaret set down her sewing and moved to kneel before him, grasping his thin hands in hers. "This isn't a story, my darling. This is real life, and real people do whatever they must to survive." "Real people, yes. But what are we now, Mama?" Thomas's dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Are we still people, or have we become something else?" Mary looked up from where she was playing with her stained doll, sensing the tension in the room without understanding its source. "Why is Thomas sad, Mama? Why won't he eat with us anymore?" Margaret's throat closed as she struggled to find words that could explain the inexplicable to a child. How could she tell Mary that her beloved older brother was choosing starvation over participating in their monstrous survival? How could she make an 8-year-old understand moral complexities that were tearing her own soul apart? "Thomas is just feeling sick to his stomach," she said finally. "Sometimes when people are very sad, they don't want to eat." But Mary was not entirely convinced. She set down her doll and approached her brother with the gentle concern that had always characterized her nature. "Are you sick because of Papa? Because he went away and left us alone?" Thomas looked at his little sister, and Margaret saw his resolve waver for the first time. Mary still lived in a world where their father had simply gone away, where the meat that kept them alive was just food that appeared on their table. Her innocence was the last pure thing left in their corrupted family. "I'm sick because I miss him," Thomas said softly, his voice breaking slightly. "I miss him so much that I can't stand it sometimes." Mary climbed onto Thomas's lap with the easy affection of a beloved younger sibling. "I miss him too, but Mama says he's watching over us from heaven, making sure we have enough food to stay strong until spring comes." Margaret watched her children embrace, saw the love that still existed between them despite the horror that surrounded their lives. Thomas held Mary with desperate tenderness, as if she were made of spun glass, and Margaret realized that he was trying to protect his sister's innocence, even as he struggled with his own moral crisis. That evening, when dinner time came, Thomas sat at the table with his empty bowl while the others ate. Margaret tried to coax him to take just a small portion, but he shook his head with quiet determination. Mary shared her food with him, pushing pieces of meat toward his side of the table with generous concern, not understanding why he wouldn't accept them. Baby James ate with the thoughtless contentment of an infant, his small hands grasping at the precious nutrition that kept him growing and strong. He was the only one among them who remained untouched by the knowledge of what they had become. As night fell, Margaret realized that their family was fracturing in new ways. The secret she had tried so hard to keep had become a wedge between her and her eldest son. And now she faced the possibility of watching Thomas starve himself rather than participate in their survival. The first green shoot pushed through the melting snow like a tiny flag of surrender, its tender leaves bright against the dirty white that had covered their world for so many months. Margaret knelt beside it in the muddy slush, her trembling fingers touching the delicate plant with something approaching reverence. Spring was coming at last, bringing with it the promise of rescue and the terror of discovery. Thomas had been refusing food for 6 days now, and the effects were already showing. His face had grown gaunt again, his cheekbones sharp beneath skin that seemed stretched too tight. But his eyes held a clarity that Margaret found more disturbing than his physical deterioration. He watched her with the steady gaze of someone who had made peace with his choice, who had found dignity in starvation. "Look, Mama," Mary called from where she was playing near the cabin. "The snow is making water everywhere." It was true. The sound of melting filled the air, dripping from the roof, trickling down the cabin walls, and forming rivulets that carved new paths through their yard. The harsh silence of winter was giving way to the gentle music of thaw, and with each drop, Margaret felt her time running out. She had perhaps 2 weeks of Samuel's remains left, carefully rationed to sustain Mary and baby James through the final stretch of winter. But Thomas's refusal to eat had forced her to face a terrible calculus. Should she increase the other children's portions to make up for what Thomas wouldn't consume, or should she preserve what remained, knowing that spring might be more promise than reality? The green shoot seemed to mock her with its optimism. One plant did not mean an end to winter. There could be more storms, more weeks of cold that would kill any hope of foraging or hunting. Margaret had heard stories of false springs that lured desperate people into premature celebrations, only to dash their hopes with renewed blizzards. She stood slowly, her joints stiff from kneeling in the wet snow. The physical toll of their ordeal had aged her beyond her years. But it was the spiritual weight that truly bent her back. Each morning she woke, hoping that this would be the day salvation arrived. And each evening she faced the possibility that tomorrow she would have to make the walk to the back room once more. Thomas appeared at her side, moving with the careful deliberation of someone conserving his strength. "It's beautiful," he said, looking down at the tiny plant. "Papa would have been excited to see it." Margaret's throat tightened at the casual way her son spoke of his father, as if Samuel were simply away on a long hunting trip rather than lying in pieces in their root cellar. Thomas's ability to separate the man Samuel had been from what his body had become was a kind of grace that Margaret envied and feared in equal measure. "Thomas, please," she said for the 100th time, "just a little. You're wasting away." "I'm not wasting away, Mama. I'm choosing away." Thomas touched the green shoot with the same reverence she had shown. "Some choices matter more than the consequences." His words carried an echo of the man he would have become under different circumstances, the kind of person Samuel would have been proud to call his son. But Margaret wondered if noble principles were worth the price he was paying for them. What good was moral purity if it led to death? Mary ran to them through the slush, her boots splashing in the muddy water. The little girl's cheeks were pink with health, her eyes bright with the energy that protein had restored to her small body. She was living proof that Margaret's choices had worked, that her children could survive the unsurvivable when their mother was willing to sacrifice everything for them. "Can we pick flowers soon, Mama?" Mary asked, crouching beside the green shoot with delight. "Like you promised? Soon, sweetheart," Margaret replied, though she wondered what kind of flowers could grow in soil watered by such horror. Would the earth itself be poisoned by what they had done? Would the valley remember their sins long after they were gone? Baby James babbled happily in Margaret's arms, reaching for the bright green leaves with the fascination that marked every stage of his development. He was walking steadily now, his small body strong and healthy, unmarked by the knowledge that would haunt his siblings for the rest of their lives. The afternoon sun felt warm on Margaret's face, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things. Somewhere to the south, people were preparing their gardens, planning their crops, living lives untouched by the choices that winter had forced upon her family. Soon those people might come looking for them, might want to hear the story of how the Holbrook family had survived when so many others perished. Margaret looked at the green shoot once more, then at Thomas's determined face, then at Mary's innocent joy. Spring was coming, but it would bring judgment along with salvation. The approaching footprints in the melting snow led straight toward their cabin, like an arrow of inevitability, each depression in the muddy slush marking the end of their terrible isolation. Margaret stood at the window, her hand pressed against the glass, watching the tracks grow closer with each passing hour. Someone was multiple people, judging by the overlapping prints, and with them would come questions that had no acceptable answer. She had tried to prepare for this moment through the long winter nights, rehearsing explanations that might satisfy curious neighbors without revealing the full horror of their survival. Samuel had died in the storm. They had survived on stored food and what little game she could trap. Simple, believable, a story that preserved both their secret and their dignity. But the threadness of their true circumstances lay everywhere for those who knew how to look. The depleted stores in the root cellar, Samuel's body, or what remained of it, wrapped now in canvas and hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards. The unnatural health of her children compared to what should have been months of slow starvation. Thomas found her at the window, his face gaunt but his eyes still bright with the fever of his moral stand. "How many?" he asked quietly. "3, maybe 4 people. The prints are hard to read in this slush." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands rakes as she adjusted the curtains. "They'll be here by evening if they keep their pace." "What will you tell them?" Margaret looked at her son, this child who had become her confessor and her conscience, and realized she didn't know. All her carefully rehearsed explanations seemed thin and unconvincing when faced with the reality of actual people asking actual questions. "The truth," she said finally, "or as much of it as they can bear." Thomas nodded slowly. "I won't lie for you, Mama. If they ask me directly, I'll tell them what happened." The words should have frightened her, but instead Margaret felt a strange relief. The burden of secrecy had grown heavier with each passing day, and perhaps it was time to share that weight with others, regardless of the consequences. Mary appeared in the doorway, her cloth doll clutched in her small arms. "Mama, why do you both look so worried? Are the people coming to visit us?" Margaret knelt down to her daughter's level, studying the innocent face that had been the light in their darkest hours. Mary still lived in a world where visitors meant celebration, where people came calling with good intentions and warm greetings. How could Margaret explain that these approaching strangers might well be the agents of their family's destruction? "Yes, sweetheart, people are coming to check on us, to make sure we're all right after the long winter. Will they bring presents?" Will they want to stay for dinner? The questions pierced Margaret's heart. Dinner. The simple, civilized ritual of sharing a meal with neighbors and friends. She tried to imagine setting a table, serving food prepared from conventional ingredients, making conversation about weather and crops and community gossip. The normalcy of such an interaction seemed as foreign as a fairy tale. Baby James crawled across the floor, pulling himself up on Margaret's legs, with the determined cheerfulness that had sustained them all through the worst moments. He babbled happily, reaching for Mary's doll with grasping fingers, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. Margaret lifted him into her arms, feeling his solid warmth against her chest. Whatever else happened, whatever judgment awaited them, she had kept her children alive. They were breathing, growing, surviving against odds that should have claimed them all. The price had been terrible, but the alternative would have been unthinkable. The footprints continued their steady approach, and Margaret found herself wondering who was making them. Jake Morrison, perhaps, returning early from his winter retreat to check on the scattered families in his territory. Or maybe neighbors from one of the other cabins, people who had weathered their own hardships and were now venturing out to see who had survived the brutal season. Whoever they were, they would find a family forever changed by their ordeal. Thomas, aged beyond his years and carrying knowledge no child should possess. Mary, still innocent but marked by months of hunger and fear. Baby James, healthy and strong but fed on horrors that would haunt them all if the truth ever came to light. And Margaret herself, transformed from a frontier wife and mother into something that existed outside the boundaries of civilized society. She had become a creature of pure survival instinct, capable of acts that would horrify the very people whose footprints now approached her door. The sun was setting, painting the muddy landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and Margaret knew that by morning everything would be different. The footprints would reach their destination, and with them would come the reckoning she had been dreading since the first terrible meal. The bone fragments lay scattered beneath the cabin's floorboards, like damning evidence in a courtroom, white splinters and gnawed joints that told a story no amount of explanation could soften. Jake Morrison held his lantern lower, his weathered face growing pale as the light illuminated the unmistakable remains of human consumption. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Doc Brennan, his medical training making him the first to understand fully what they were seeing. "Margaret, what have you done?" The three men had arrived just after sunset, their voices calling cheerfully through the spring air as they approached the cabin. Jake had brought supplies and mail from town, expecting to find a family weakened by winter but essentially intact. Instead, they discovered a tableau that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around baby James, while Thomas and Mary huddled close to her skirts. She had made no attempt to deny what the men had found, had simply stood silent as they searched the cabin with growing horror and understanding. "They were starving," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying no trace of shame or regret. "My children were dying, and I had a choice to make." "There's always another choice," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen enough frontier hardships to understand the impossible decisions that isolation could force upon a person. "You could have rationed better, hunted more, found some other way. With what? I had no ammunition left, no traps that worked, no food that hadn't already been consumed." Margaret's composure remained unshakable, as if she had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. "My husband died trying to save us, and I used the only resource we had left." Doc Brennan, who had written to them about the Donner Party tragedy, now found himself face to face with a similar horror in his own community. "The children," he said, his voice barely audible. "Did they know?" Thomas stepped forward, his thin shoulders squared with the dignity that had sustained him through his hunger strike. "I knew. I helped her sometimes, when the work was too hard for her to manage alone." The admission hit the three men like a physical blow. Bad enough that a mother had been driven to cannibalism, but the idea that a 12-year-old boy had participated in the butchering of his own father crossed every boundary of civilized understanding. I stopped eating it when I realized what it was. Thomas continued with calm precision. But I don't blame Mama for what she did. She kept us alive when nothing else could have. Mary looked up at the strange men with confused eyes, sensing their distress without understanding its source. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked innocently. "Mama makes very good stew." The third man, a neighbor named Peters from a cabin 15 miles south, turned away and retched violently into the corner. The sound of his revulsion filled the cabin, mingling with the crackle of the fire and baby James's contented babbling. Jake Morrison had seen terrible things in his years on the frontier: Indian raids, bear attacks, men driven mad by isolation and hardship. But nothing had prepared him for this domestic horror, this perversion of family life that challenged every assumption about civilization and motherhood. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice steady as granite. "Will you take my children away from me? Will you turn me over to the territorial authorities?" Doc Brennan struggled with the question, his medical oath warring with his moral revulsion. As a doctor, he understood the lengths to which people would go to preserve life. As a member of civilized society, he could not condone what Margaret had done, regardless of her motivations. "The children are healthy," he said finally, his clinical training taking over. Remarkably so, considering what they should have endured. They show no signs of malnutrition, no evidence of the wasting that should have killed them weeks ago. It was both an observation and an accusation. The children's robust health was proof positive of their unnatural diet, evidence that could not be explained away or ignored. Margaret shifted baby James to her other arm, the infant reaching for the lantern light with curious fingers. "I regret nothing," she said with quiet finality. "Look at them. Look at my babies, alive and growing and strong. Whatever you think of my methods, you cannot argue with my results." The bone fragments beneath the floorboards seemed to glisten in the lantern light, a scattered testimony to the price of survival. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal, but inside the cabin, winter's darkest legacy had finally been brought into the unforgiving light of judgment. The abandoned cabin stood like a monument to horror in the valley, its empty windows staring blindly across the meadow, where wildflowers now bloomed in profusion. Margaret's rocking chair sat on the front porch, weathered by rain and sun, slowly rotting away like the memory of the woman who had once found comfort in its gentle motion. 2 years had passed since that terrible spring discovery, and the Holbrook cabin had become a place of whispered legends and fearful superstition. Children from the growing settlement of Millfield dared each other to approach its sagging walls, while adults crossed themselves and hurried past when business took them through the valley. Margaret herself had vanished into the vastness of the territory, taking baby James with her and disappearing so completely that some wondered if she had ever existed at all. The authorities had debated prosecution, but what court could adequately judge a mother's choice between watching her children starve or crossing the ultimate taboo? In the end, they had simply banished her from civilized society, trusting the frontier's harsh justice to render its own verdict. Thomas lived now with the Morrison family, Jake having taken pity on the boy, whose courage and integrity had impressed even those horrified by his family's survival. But the child who helped with chores and studied his letters was a shadow of the boy who had once carved wooden horses with his father. He spoke little, ate less, and often stood staring toward the abandoned cabin with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Mary had been adopted by Doc Brennan and his wife, childless folks, who showered her with the kind of gentle affection she desperately needed. The little girl remembered almost nothing of that terrible winter, her mind having protected itself by burying the memories too deep for conscious recall. She played with dolls and laughed at simple jokes, but sometimes she woke screaming from nightmares she could not explain. The valley itself seemed to remember what had transpired within its boundary. The creek ran clear and cold as always, but hunters reported that game avoided the area around the cabin. Flowers grew in strange patterns near the old root cellar, and the apple tree Samuel had planted their first spring had withered and died despite the rich soil and adequate rainfall. Old Pete Carlson, the prospector who had struck gold the previous year, claimed he sometimes heard voices on the wind when he passed through the valley. A woman weeping, a child calling for his papa, the sound of a rocking chair creaking on a porch where no chair remained. Pete was known for his fondness for whiskey, but even the skeptical found his stories unsettling. The cabin's logs had begun to sag and separate, letting in rain and snow, and the small creatures that reclaimed abandoned places. The roof sagged dangerously, and the door hung askew on its hinges, creaking in the wind like a voice trying to speak. Inside, the furnishings had been removed or destroyed, but stains remained on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate. Jake Morrison made it a point to check on the cabin periodically, though he could never say exactly why. Perhaps it was respect for Samuel's memory, or concern that vagrants might take shelter there and discover things better left undisturbed. Or perhaps it was simply morbid fascination with the site where civilization had collided with survival and lost. On his latest visit, Jake found evidence that someone had been living in the ruins recently. A small fire in the old hearth, scraps of food, and tracks too small to belong to an adult man. His blood ran cold as he realized the implications. Margaret had returned, drawn back to the valley where she had made her terrible choices, unable to escape the gravity of what she had done. He searched the surrounding area but found no sign of her or the child she had taken. Only the abandoned cabin remained, slowly surrendering to time and weather, its empty rooms holding secrets that would never be fully understood or forgiven. As Jake rode away, he carried with him the weight of knowledge that some stories had no proper endings, only fading echoes that lingered in empty places. The legend of Margaret Holbrook would outlive them all, passed down in whispers around frontier fires, a cautionary tale about the prices people paid for survival and the lines that mothers would cross to keep their children breathing. The rocking chair creaked once in the evening breeze, then fell silent, keeping its vigil over a valley that had learned to fear the depths of love's desperate measures.